Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times. I'm the Man of the West, also from the Prancing Pony podcast. Let's keep week 57 going with today's Tolkien Tuesday. Now, today will be the last Tolkien Tuesday, at least as far as I can see, in Humphrey Carpenter's book, The Inklings. We've had a really interesting time examining the similarities and differences between the men who made up the Inklings. Today, I'm wrapping up the chapter, A Fox That Isn't There. Now, last week we looked at Lewis's thoughts on male friendships and on women. Today we're going to look at Tolkien and Williams, through Carpenter's eyes at least. Just as with Lewis, male friendship was a critical part of Tolkien's life. Now, we've talked on this very show about the central role that his friendship with the young men of the TCBS played in shaping Tolkien as a person and as a writer. But while male friendship was still an essential part of Tolkien's life, he differed from Lewis in that he had experienced romantic love in his youth. He was only 16 when he fell in love with Edith Bratt, then 19. But as we've talked about before, and as you probably already know, the two of them were kept apart by Tolkien's guardian, and he was, in essence, forced for a period of time to rely solely on his friendships with other young men. As Carpenter writes, this had an unexpected effect. By the time Tolkien was reunited with Edith, he had, as it were, lost touch with her, and had devoted the greater part of his deepest affections to his male friends. Now, of course, as we know, he and Edith would marry and go on to have 4 children. It's a pretty big difference from Lewis and his life, at least at this point. And yet it seems that Tolkien worked hard to keep his domestic life and his friendships with men entirely separate. Carpenter writes, family affairs, though of great interest and importance to Tolkien, seemed to him to be quite apart from his life with his male friends. This division of his life into watertight compartments inevitably caused a strain, and Edith Tolkien resented the fact that such a large part of her husband's affections were lavished on Lewis and other men friends, while Tolkien himself felt that time spent with the Inklings and in other male company could only be gained by a deliberate and almost ruthless exclusion of attention to his wife. After this, Carpenter quotes a letter that Tolkien wrote to his son Michael. Now, until recently, that letter had not been published anywhere, but now that we have the revised and expanded edition of the letters, we can go look at it directly and actually get more context than Carpenter provides in his book. The letter was written on March 12, 1941. Michael was 20 years old. He was set to marry a nurse, Joan Griffith, whom he'd met during the war. His father was giving him advice in what we now have as Letter 43A. He writes, "One word of really sound advice, not any the easier to take for that. Get in straight and keep there with lover, fiancé, wife. Quite apart from love, there are many things that a man feels are legitimate even though they cause a fuss. Let him not lie about them to his wife or lover. Cut them out. Or if worth a fight, fight. Just insist. A little fuss early saves a mort of trouble later. Such matters do not usually arise until at least a formal engagement. Then each side has a certain claim. Then they may arise frequently. The glass of beer, the pipe, the non-writing of letters, the other friend, etc., etc. If the other side's claims really are unreasonable, as they are at times between the dearest lovers and most loving married folk, they are much better met by above-board refusal and fuss than subterfuge." Well, I suppose the idea of being upfront is certainly a good one. I mean, not lying about things is generally good advice. But fussing and fighting and simply refusing to accede to the other side, well, kids, don't try this at home. As Carpenter adds, Edith Tolkien was capable of responding to this attitude with equal obstinacy, and as a result, the atmosphere in the Tolkien household at Northmoor Road was sometimes as difficult as that in Lewis's home. Now, Carpenter points out that we might be led to conclude that Tolkien's reasoning for this compartmentalization and focus on male friendships was similar to Lewis, that he felt women simply weren't as intellectual as men. And there is some evidence to suggest this. In Letter 43, also to Michael, written just a few days before 43A that we just read from, Tolkien argues that women can, in fact, often achieve very remarkable insight and understanding, even of things otherwise outside their natural range. For it is their gift to be receptive, stimulated, fertilized in many other matters than the physical by the male. I see what you did there, Professor. Every teacher knows that, he continues, how quickly an intelligent woman can be taught, grasp his ideas, see his point, and how, with rare exceptions, they can go no further when they leave his hand or when they cease to take a personal interest in him. I'm not sure I want to even try to comment on that. I'm just going to go back to Carpenter, who tries to rebuild Tolkien a little by pointing out that he was not at all condescending to his many women pupils, and he helped several of them to achieve considerable academic distinction. And certainly that last part is proven by the evidence. We see a number of projects in which he helped women achieve considerable academic distinction. Now, Carpenter does point out one other difference in how Tolkien and Lewis viewed male friendships. Lewis felt that all his friendships were equally important in their way, he argues, with Lewis caring for Barfield, Williams, and Tolkien equally. On the other hand, Carpenter says that Tolkien was more selective with his affections. Now, that doesn't mean he didn't like them all a great deal, of course. Carpenter says that Tolkien had much affection and respect for Warnie Lewis, whom he actually considered to be unfairly overshadowed by Jack. Also that he had a deep fondness for Havard, whose company he greatly valued, especially in his later years when Havard was a neighbor and close confidant. Still, while his friendships with Barfield, Dyson, Williams, and others were important and played a large role in his life, Carpenter concludes that his affection for Jack Lewis was more profound. His feelings for the other Inklings never equaled it. And we've talked about that with Serena a few weeks ago early in this series, that Tolkien's deep affection for Lewis may have been a part of why he seemed to keep Williams at arm's length a bit, especially after the fact. Now, speaking of Williams, Carpenter explains that he had a complexity of views. That's not a surprise at all, given Williams. He held opinions that were shared with both Lewis and Tolkien. But unlike Tolkien, he didn't see the need to compartmentalize. The emotions of male friendship and romantic love were not, in Williams' eyes, largely incompatible. Carpenter argues that Williams undoubtedly regarded romantic love as ultimately of far greater importance than things native and natural to the male. Well, this, of course, set him strongly apart from Lewis and Tolkien. And he certainly didn't share Lewis's views on the headship of the husband. Carpenter cites a statement that Williams made about Milton's view of marriage in Paradise Lost, and in that work, his view is quite close to Lewis's view. Williams says, "Milton's principles of the relations of the sexes may have been all wrong, probably because any principle of the relations of the sexes will be wrong, since there are, after all, no such things. There are an infinite number of women and an infinite number of men." You know, I like that. None of the others, Barfield, Dyson, Havard, and more, depended as much on male friendship as Lewis did, according to Carpenter. In some ways, he was the center of these friendships, and Tolkien observed this. In letter 64 to Christopher Tolkien, written in 1944, Tolkien refers to the Inklings as the Lewis Seance, and as Carpenter concludes, there was more than an element of truth in this. They were Lewis's friends. The group gathered round him, and in the end, one does not have to look any further than Lewis to see why it came into being. He himself is the fox. For now, this wraps up this week's Tolkien Tuesday and this series. Be sure to join me again next series. Remember, the TTT takes 2 weeks off between 8-week series, as we, I think, will go back into the revised and expanded edition of Tolkien's letters. But that 3-volume set of Tolkien's poetry was recently released, and maybe I'll take a look at that instead. We'll see. In the meantime, please visit patreon.com/TolkienTimes to learn how you can join the Content Council and be a part of deciding what it is I talk about on Tolkien Tuesday's next series. You can also support the show, get an ad-free feed and a bonus episode every week. Then join me again tomorrow on today's Tolkien Times for Word Nerd Wednesday. If you're watching this on YouTube, like and subscribe. Follow or subscribe in your podcast apps and follow @Tolkien Times on social media. Finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.